Daughter called me from a parking garage in downtown Charlotte at 7 in the evening on a Tuesday, not from the house, not from her office, from a parking garage, because she said she didn't know where else to go that felt private enough to fall apart. Her voice was the kind of quiet that takes effort to maintain. She said my son-in-law's mother had called a family meeting that afternoon and told her in front of her husband and both of his sisters that she was being removed from her position at Whitmore Capital Group, that the firm had discovered irregularities in client portfolios she had managed, and that if she left quietly, they would not pursue legal action. She said my son-in-law had sat at the end of the table and not looked at her once. She said she had driven to the parking garage because she couldn't drive home to a house that had his mother's name on the deed. I told her to stay where she was. I was already reaching for my keys. What I did not tell her was that Whitmore Capital Group had been operating for 11 years under a broker-dealer license that I had co-signed as a founding silent partner. What I did not tell her was that I had been waiting quietly for 2 years to see whether the people she had married into were going to be what I suspected they were. I was 63 years old. I had learned a long time ago that patience is not weakness, it is preparation. The drive from Ballantyne to uptown Charlotte took me 26 minutes in evening traffic. I found my daughter on the third level of the garage, sitting in her car with the windows up and the engine off. She had her forehead against the steering wheel. My granddaughter was in the back seat in her car seat, 4 years old, eating crackers from a bag, watching something on a tablet with her headphones on. She didn't know anything was wrong. At 4, the world is still arranged around snacks and cartoons, and I am grateful for that. My daughter looked up when I knocked on the glass. She unlocked the door and I got in the passenger seat and she said, "Mom, I didn't do anything wrong. I know." She had spreadsheets. She had printed reports with my login credentials on every page. I know. Connor didn't say a word. He just sat there. Her voice didn't break. She was past the breaking point and into something harder, something I recognized from the mirror 20 years ago. He's known her his whole life, and he's known me for 6 years, and he just sat there. I looked at her. Outside, the parking garage was gray and smelled like exhaust and old concrete. She had given Whitmore Capital Group 4 years of her career. She had built their retirement planning division from a 2-person operation to a team of 14. She had brought in clients who had stayed because of her specifically, because of the way she returned calls on Saturdays and remembered birthdays and showed up when the market dropped and people were scared. His mother had repaid her by printing fabricated reports and sitting across a conference table with her arms folded. "Tell me everything," I said. "All of it. Start from the beginning." She talked for 40 minutes. I let her. The pattern she described was not new to me. It never is, with women like Dolores Whitmore. It starts small. A comment about instinct versus experience. A meeting scheduled for a time she couldn't attend. Apologies, no apologies. The slow narrowing of the circle until one person stands at the center of everything and the person who married into the family is always half a step outside. Always proving, always grateful. Never quite enough. My daughter had called it demanding. She had called it high standards. She had told me twice, when I raised my concerns, that Dolores was difficult but not cruel, that the Whitmores had been good to them, that Connor was trying. I had not pushed. I had watched. When she finished, my granddaughter pulled off her headphones and said, "Grammy, I have crackers." She held the bag out to me through the gap between the front seats. I took one. I told her it was delicious. She put her headphones back on, satisfied. My daughter watched me over the console. Her eyes were dry, but the set of her jaw told me everything about what it had cost her to get there. "What do I do?" she said. I looked at her. The uptown skyline was visible through the garage opening, glass towers catching the last of the October light. The Whitmore building was on Tryon Street, 16 floors of steel and tinted glass that had become the symbol of everything that family had spent 3 decades building. I had attended the ribbon cutting in 2019. I had signed my name to the documents that allowed it to exist. "Let me make a phone call," I said. My house in Ballantyne had been too quiet for 2 years. Since my husband passed and my daughter moved 30 minutes north and the rooms stopped knowing what to do with themselves. That night, it felt right again. My granddaughter ate a bowl of pasta and fell asleep on the couch before 8 o'clock, one arm wrapped around the stuffed rabbit she took everywhere. My daughter sat at the kitchen table and wrapped both hands around a mug of chamomile tea she didn't drink, and I sat across from her and called Diane Okafor, my attorney, and told her I needed her at my house at 7 in the morning. Then I called Franklin, who had worked for me for 16 years and who understood that when I used the word urgent, I meant it precisely. I need the full compliance record for Whitmore Capital Group, I said. Every regulatory filing from the last 24 months. Every account my daughter managed. Every document that touched her login credentials. And I need the internal communication logs if you can get them through the Discovery Channel we discussed in August. A pause. 48 hours, he said. 36, I said. I'll explain why in the morning. I hung up and went to my office. I opened the folder I had created in the fall of 2022 when my daughter told me she had been offered a position at her mother-in-law's firm and was thinking of taking it. I had told her to think carefully. She had told me Dolores had personally asked for her. She had been proud. I'd smiled and said nothing about what I already knew about the Whitmore family's regulatory history, about the complaint that had been quietly settled in 2019, about the pattern of documentation issues that their compliance officer had flagged internally and then stopped flagging. I had built the folder quietly: corporate filings, Fendry records, the broker-dealer license, and the chain of signatures beneath it. It was not a complicated document. It simply said in the plain language of financial regulation that Whitmore Capital Group had been granted its operating license under a co-sponsorship arrangement with a holding company called Aldercroft Financial Partners, and that Aldercroft's managing partner, as of the original filing date in 2013 and every renewal since, was a woman named Nora Calloway, my maiden name. I had used it deliberately when I established Aldercroft 12 years before my daughter met Connor Whitmore at a fundraiser in South Park. I had kept the arrangement quiet because it was professionally appropriate to do so. When my daughter married into the family, I made the decision to give them time, to watch, to see what kind of people they were when the stakes were low and no one who mattered to them was watching. They had shown me who they were. I closed the folder and poured a small glass of bourbon and stood at the window. The backyard was dark. Inside, my granddaughter was asleep on the couch with her rabbit, and my daughter was at the kitchen table, and I was in my office holding a glass I wasn't drinking and thinking about what comes next when you have been patient for long enough. Dolores Whitmore had sat across a conference table from my daughter and handed her son a fabricated set of compliance violations as though it were a gift. She had used my daughter's name and my daughter's login and 4 years of my daughter's work as raw material for something she had been constructing for months. I would give her exactly what she had built toward. Diane was at my door at 6:58. She sat across my desk with her yellow legal pad and the specific expression she wears when she has already been thinking about something since I called her the night before. "Walk me through what they presented," she said. I did. When I finished, she wrote for 30 seconds without speaking. "Fabricated compliance documents," she said. "That's securities fraud if the alterations touched client account data. Wrongful termination, defamation of professional character." She looked up. "Did they make any threats about regulatory reporting?" "They said if my daughter did not leave without dispute, they would file a formal complaint with FinRe and report the violations to the SEC. Diane set her pen down. "At attempted extortion and abuse of regulatory process." She looked at me over her reading glasses. "What do you want?" "Everything," I said, "but I need 4 days." She studied me. "You're setting something up." "I'm making sure the right people are in the right room when the truth arrives," I said. She wrote something on her pad. "The Whitmore Foundation Gala is Saturday, the Ballantine Grand. Conrad Whitmore is being honored by the Charlotte Business Journal." I already knew. I had received my invitation 3 weeks earlier, addressed to Nora Calloway, Aldercroft Financial Partners. The Whitmores had sent it themselves. "Don't change anything," I said. "We'll all be there." Franklin arrived Thursday morning with a document case and no expression. He sat in the chair across my desk and opened it without preamble. "She started building the file 8 months ago," he said. "The compliance violations are real documents, but the account numbers have been rerouted. In 4 cases, transaction authorizations that appear to carry your daughter's digital signature were generated from a workstation she did not have access to on the dates in question. I had a forensic analyst confirm it overnight. He slid a printed report across the desk. The metadata doesn't match the displayed timestamps, he said. Someone modified the files after the fact and didn't clean the audit trail. I set down my coffee. Who had access to that workstation? The firm's chief compliance officer, a man named Douglas. He has been with Whitmore Capital for 9 years. Franklin paused. He also has a private loan outstanding through a lender called Meridian Bridge Finance. Significant amount. He's been making partial payments for 14 months. I looked at him. Find out who owns Meridian Bridge. Franklin almost smiled. I already did. Aldercroft Financial Partners acquired the loan portfolio in 2021. I looked at him. You hold his debt, he said. I picked up the bourbon I hadn't finished 2 nights ago and moved it to the side of the desk. Dolores Whitmore had used a man I already had leverage over to build a fraud case against my daughter. I called Diane at 9 and told her we had forensic confirmation. She said she would begin drafting. I told her I needed one more thing before we moved. The call came Friday afternoon. My daughter sat at my kitchen table. Diane sat beside her with a recording application running on a tablet. I stood near the window where I could see my granddaughter in the backyard with the neighbor's dog, a big, soft retriever she had named, for reasons she had never explained, Professor. My daughter answered on the second ring and put it on speaker. Dolores Whitmore's voice was warm in the particular way of someone who has practiced warmth until it sounds almost real. She said she was sorry the week had been difficult. She said she understood this was hard. She said she hoped the little one was doing well. My daughter said nothing. I want to be direct with you, Dolores said. Connor and I have talked, and we believe there's a path through this that doesn't have to damage anyone permanently. What we're asking is straightforward. A written acknowledgement that there were lapses in your oversight of the accounts. You don't need to characterize them as intentional, just acknowledge that errors occurred under your management. My daughter's hands were flat on the table. I didn't make errors, she said. A pause. The warmth in Dolores's voice adjusted by 1 precise degree. I have been very restrained about the timeline here. I haven't contacted Finray. I haven't spoken to the SEC. I've given you space because I was hopeful we could resolve this quietly. Another pause. But if you leave me without options, I'll have to act in the interest of the firm. And at that point, the matter of Lily's primary custody arrangement will also need to be revisited. My daughter's jaw went tight. You're threatening my daughter's custody, she said. I'm telling you that a parent with an active securities fraud investigation is going to face questions in family court. That's not a threat. That's how it works. The warmth returned. Sign the acknowledgement. Accept a settlement. Walk away with your license clean and a co-parenting structure that works for everyone. Think about what's best for Lily. The line was quiet for a moment. My daughter looked at me across the table. I gave her one small nod. I'll think about it, she said. That's all I'm asking. The call ended. Diane clicked off the recording and looked up from her pad. Extortion, she said. Custodial coercion. Attempted regulatory fraud. She set her pen down. We have everything. I walked to the window. In the backyard, my granddaughter had convinced the retriever to sit and was now standing in front of him with one hand raised, very seriously, as though she were about to deliver a lecture. Saturday, I said. Conrad Whitmore will stand at a podium and accept his award. Diane waited. He'll receive his legacy, I said. All of it. The next 2 days moved the way they always do when you have been preparing for something long enough that the execution becomes almost calm. I called my contact at First Carolina Commercial Bank, a man named Theodore whom I had worked with for 14 years, and told him I needed to acquire all outstanding debt associated with Whitmore Capital Group LLC and with Conrad and Dolores Whitmore personally. Theodore pulled the numbers. $4.2 million across commercial credit lines, a personal loan Conrad had taken in the spring, and a refinanced mortgage on their home in Myers Park. A same-day acquisition, I said. What's the structure? 15% discount on a clean close. That puts you at 3.5 million, he said. Wire it by noon, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Nora, you'll be their only creditor. That's correct, I said. He won't know until you want him to, Theodore said. By 2 o'clock Thursday, I held every dollar Conrad Whitmore owed to anyone. I instructed Franklin to initiate a routine creditor change review on the associated accounts. By Friday morning, the Whitmores' credit lines would show flags they had no framework to explain. Friday afternoon, I drove to Tryon Street. I had not been inside the Whitmore building since the ribbon cutting, but I knew its floor plan from the original filings, and I knew the building management office was on the fourth floor, and I knew the name of the property manager because I had signed documents with her predecessor. I rode the elevator. I sat across from the property manager, a practical woman named Helen who had been in commercial real estate for 20 years. And I showed her the Aldercroft licensing agreement and the co-sponsorship clause that most people never read because it was on page 31 of a document that had been signed in a conference room in 2013 and filed and forgotten. The clause allowed the co-sponsoring entity to withdraw operational authorization in the event of documented regulatory bad faith by the primary license holder. I had the forensic report in my bag. Helen read the clause. She read it again. Then she looked at me and said, "How long do you need?" I said, "I'm giving them 90 days. That's more than the clause requires." She nodded slowly. "I'll prepare the notice." I thanked her and took the elevator back down and walked through the marble lobby and out onto Tryon Street into the October afternoon. The building rose behind me, 16 floors of glass and steel that Conrad Whitmore had pointed to for a decade as the proof of what he had built. He had built it on a license I controlled. He had just never read far enough to know my name. That evening, my daughter called me into the living room. She was sitting on the floor with my granddaughter, both of them in pajamas, a picture book open between them. My granddaughter looked up when I came in. "Grammy," she said, "Mom says we're going to a party tomorrow." "That's right," I said. "Mom says I get to stay here with Mrs. Avendari, Tremaine, and watch movies and have popcorn." She considered this arrangement with the seriousness it deserved. "That's a good deal," she said. "It really is," I said. My daughter looked up at me from the floor. There was still uncertainty in her eyes, but underneath it something else was beginning. Something I recognized. I had seen it in myself 25 years ago when I was alone and starting over and decided that I was not going to build a smaller life just because someone expected me to. "Mom." Her voice was quiet. "What exactly happens tomorrow night?" I crouched down and smoothed my granddaughter's hair back from her face, just to have a moment to find the right words. "Conrad Whitmore is going to receive his award," I said, "and then the truth is going to be in the room with him." My daughter looked at the picture book. Then she looked at me. "You've been ready for this for a long time." "I hoped I was wrong about them," I said. I wasn't. She was quiet. My granddaughter turned a page, narrating softly to herself, unaware that the two women on either side of her had just decided the shape of what came next. The Ballantine Grand Ballroom held 400 people when it was set for a formal dinner, which it was Saturday night. Round tables, white linens, the kind of centerpieces that cost more than they should. Charlotte's business community in black tie. Moving through the cocktail hour with the particular ease of people who have been coming to rooms like this for long enough that the rooms have stopped feeling like anything. Conrad Whitmore stood near the bar at the far end of the reception area. He was a tall man, silver at the temples, with the handshake and the eye contact of someone who had spent his whole career in rooms and understood that confidence is a performance, and he had given enough performances that it had become real. His wife stood beside him in green, precise, smiling with the calibrated warmth I had heard on the telephone recording. They had not seen me yet. I found the audiovisual manager near the production table at the back of the ballroom. He was a young man I had hired on Wednesday, introduced to the venue staff as a technical consultant for the evening's presentation. He had spent 2 days preparing exactly what I had given him. He gave me a small nod when I arrived and went back to his equipment without a word. I took my seat at a table along the side wall, close enough to see the stage, far enough to be unremarkable. Diane sat to my left. Franklin sat on her other side. At 8 o'clock, the light shifted and the master of ceremonies approached the podium. He said things that people say at these events about legacy and commitment and the kind of character that leaves a mark on a city. The applause began before he finished. Conrad Whitmore walked to the podium with the award in his hands. He set it down and looked out at the room with the expression of a man who had never genuinely questioned whether this moment was deserved. "I've spent 30 years in this business," he said, "and if there is one thing I have learned, it is that the only foundation that lasts is the one you build on integrity." I sent Franklin a message. 2 words. The presentation screen behind Conrad Whitmore, set up for the award slideshow, went dark. He didn't notice. He was still speaking. The screen filled with a document. White background, black text. A FinRe co-sponsorship agreement. The signature line at the bottom. Aldercroft Financial Partners, managing partner Nora Calloway. A murmur moved through the room. Then the compliance files appeared. My daughter's name on the header. Original documents on the left. Altered versions on the right. Differences highlighted in red. Date fields changed. Account numbers shifted. Digital signatures extracted from legitimate documents and applied to fabricated ones. Forensic analysis text overlaid each comparison. Confirmed, falsified, all instances. Conrad turned and looked at the screen. Something moved across his face that was not quite confusion and not quite fear, and was exactly what I had expected. Then the loan documents. Douglas, the chief compliance officer. The Meridian Bridge finance account. Partial payments over 14 months. Wire transfers from a shell account registered to a Whitmore family trust. Text overlaid in the same clean font. Payments received for document alteration. Then the recording. Dolores Whitmore's voice came through the ballroom speakers with the same calibrated warmth she had used on the telephone. "If you leave me without options, I'll have to act in the interest of the firm. And at that point, the matter of Lily's primary custody arrangement will also need to be revisited." A pause on the recording. Sign the acknowledgement. Accept a settlement. Walk away with your license clean and a co-parenting structure that works for everyone. Think about what's best for Lily. The room erupted. Dolores Whitmore's hand went to her throat. I stood. I walked to the stage the way I have walked into every room that required it. Steady, without apology. People stepped aside. The master of ceremonies moved back from the podium without being asked. I took the microphone. 380 faces turned toward me. I looked at Conrad Whitmore first, then at his wife. "My name is Nora Calloway," I said. "I am the managing partner of Aldercroft Financial Partners. I've been the co-sponsoring license holder for Whitmore Capital Group since the firm's original FINRA registration in 2013. I paused. Conrad Whitmore did not build his firm on integrity. He built it on a license that belongs to me. The room was completely silent. My daughter gave this family 4 years of her career, her expertise, and her trust. In return, his wife fabricated a compliance fraud case against her, coerced a 9-year employee to falsify regulatory documents, and threatened to use my granddaughter's custody arrangement as leverage if my daughter refused to sign a false confession. I turned to face the room. The recording you just heard is one of 3 documented instances of extortion, custodial coercion, and attempted regulatory fraud. All of it has been submitted to FinRe and to the United States Attorney's Office for the Western District of North Carolina. Dolores stepped forward. "You have no standing as of Thursday," I said. "I purchased the entirety of your outstanding debt. Every credit line, every loan, every dollar you owe to any institution is now held by Aldercroft Financial Partners." I kept my voice exactly as level as I'd kept it through every difficult conversation of the last 6 decades. The co-sponsorship agreement contains a bad faith termination clause. I activated it Friday afternoon. Whitmore Capital Group has 90 days to surrender its broker-dealer license and cease operations. I turned back to the room. The building on Tryon Street that they have called their legacy for 11 years, the address on their letterhead, the lobby with the mahogany panels and the family name on the wall. A pause. "All of it operates under a license I control, and I am taking it back." The doors at the back of the ballroom opened. 2 federal agents walked in alongside a woman in a dark blazer, whom I recognized from a meeting at the U.S. Attorney's Office the previous Thursday. Franklin walked beside her with a document folder. "Conrad Whitmore," she said. "Dolores Whitmore, please come with us." Conrad did not move for a moment. He stood at the podium with the Crystal Award in his hands and the projection screen still running behind him, and the room reorganizing itself around a truth that had finally arrived. Then Dolores touched his arm and they walked. They did not look at me. The room was loud for a long time after. I looked at my phone. My daughter had sent one word, "Really." I typed back, "Really." The federal courthouse in Charlotte is on West Trade Street, a building that understands its own weight. I sat in a third row with Diane on my left and my daughter on my right. She wore a navy blazer she had bought the week before and her hair pulled back, and she held my hand on the armrest between us. Not tightly, just present. My granddaughter was home with Mrs. Tremaine, eating pancakes and watching something about a dog who solves mysteries. She was fine. She had no idea that the adults around her had spent the last 10 days rebuilding the world she lived in. The judge entered. We rose. Conrad Whitmore received 11 years for securities fraud, document falsification, and conspiracy to obstruct a regulatory proceeding. He was ordered to surrender all assets held under Whitmore Capital Group LLC and to pay restitution of $3.8 million. Dolores Whitmore received 13 years. The extortion and custodial coercion charges had carried weight that no attorney had been able to reduce. She was ordered to pay $1.4 million directly to my daughter and was formally barred from holding any fiduciary position or serving on any regulated board. Douglas, the compliance officer, had cooperated fully with the prosecution. He would serve 3 years. When the bailiff led them out, Conrad looked at the floor. Dolores looked straight ahead at something the rest of us couldn't see. My daughter exhaled slowly beside me. It was the sound of something leaving the body that had been carried long enough to stop feeling like weight and start feeling like structure, like something she had built herself around. She asked quietly, "Is it done?" "The legal part," I said. "Now comes the rest." 3 weeks later, I drove to Tryon Street. The building looked the same from the outside. It always would to anyone walking past. But in the lobby, the management transition team from Aldercroft was conducting its audit, and tenant notifications had gone out, and the Whitmore name had been removed from the directory by the elevator. I took the elevator to the 9th floor. My daughter stood in what had been the senior management suite of Whitmore Capital Group. The room was mostly cleared. Filing boxes along one wall, a new desk near the window, still in its packaging. She turned when I came in. She was wearing a blazer the color of deep water, one she had chosen herself, and she looked like someone who was still getting used to taking up the full amount of space she was actually allowed. "The client list is intact," she said. 59 of the 63 accounts. 3 left when the news broke. 1 came back last week. She held up a folder. "The Aldercroft licensing structure gives us a clean regulatory basis to operate independently. Diane says we can have the new registration approved within 60 days. I looked around the office. The Charlotte skyline filled the window behind her, the same skyline Conrad Whitmore had looked at from a floor above for a decade. "What are you going to call it?" I asked. She smiled, small and real. "Lakeview Capital," she said. "Lily named it." She paused. She said she wanted something that sounded like somewhere you could breathe. I laughed. Actually laughed for the first time in weeks. "She's right," I said. "It does." My daughter walked to the window and stood with the city behind her and looked at me. "Mom," she said, "I need to ask you something." I waited. "How long did you know about the license, about having the leverage?" "Since the original filing," I said. 2013. She was quiet for a moment. "And you watched for 2 years after I married Connor. You watched and you didn't say anything." "I gave them time," I said. "I hoped they would be different from what I already suspected. I wanted to be wrong." Her voice was steady. "I should have listened to you. You loved your husband," I said. "You trusted the life you were building. Those are not mistakes. Those are what love looks like before it has enough information." She looked at her hands. "The mistake," I said, "was theirs. Every single one." She nodded. Her eyes were clear. She had done her grieving in the weeks before this moment, in parking garages, and quiet kitchens and long nights, when my granddaughter was asleep, and the weight of it had nowhere to go but through her. What was left now was something steadier, something she had arrived at by going through it rather than around it. We stood at the window for a while. October had turned to November and the light was lower and cleaner, the way it gets in the Carolinas in the fall. "I want to build something here," she said. "Something that's actually mine." "I know," I said. "Something Lily grows up knowing her mother built." "You will," I said. That evening I drove to Freedom Park. My granddaughter ran ahead of me on the path along the pond, stopping to investigate things I couldn't see at her height. Leaves, mostly. A beetle she crouched beside for a full minute before deciding to let it continue its life undisturbed. She ran back to me and took my hand. "Grammy," she said. "Yes? Is Mommy going to have a new job?" "She's going to have her own company," I said. She thought about this. "Can I visit?" "Whenever you want." She nodded, satisfied, and pulled me forward on the path. My daughter caught up to us a minute later. She had 2 cups of hot cider from the cart near the park entrance, and she handed one to me and kept the other, and we walked together along the water while my granddaughter ran between us. After a while, my daughter pressed her shoulder against mine. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I thought about what Dolores Whitmore had seen when she looked at my daughter. Someone she could shape, someone who could be useful and then removed, someone whose career and confidence and 4 years of careful work could be reduced to a stack of falsified documents and a phone call with the right tone of regret. I thought about what she had seen when she looked at me, the few times she had looked at me at all. A woman of a certain age. Quiet. No obvious position in their world. The oldest miscalculation powerful people make. They see a woman who has not yet become someone to reckon with. They forget to ask how long she has been reckoning. I am 63 years old. I have been building since I was 31, when I signed my first commercial lease on a property in Concord that everyone told me was a risk and turned into the seed of everything that came after. I have been patient since long before patience became necessary. If you are watching this and you recognize something in what my daughter went through, I want you to hear me clearly. The control doesn't announce itself. It begins with a sense that you are always being evaluated and never quite passing. A standard that moves when you get close to it. An invitation that arrives after everyone else already knows the plan. The slow, careful removal of every voice that might tell you that what you are experiencing is not normal and is not your fault. Pay attention to what people do when the stakes are low and they think the outcome is already settled. That is when they show you what they actually are. My daughter is building Lakeview Capital from the 9th floor of a building on Tryon Street. My granddaughter named it something that sounds like somewhere you can breathe, and she was exactly right. Something should be named by the people who will grow up inside them. My name is Nora Calloway. I have been building for 32 years and I am not finished. Neither is my daughter. I keep coming back to the moment in the parking garage, not the ballroom, not the courthouse, the parking garage on a Tuesday evening, gray concrete and exhaust, my daughter with her forehead against the steering wheel, and my granddaughter in the back seat eating crackers because at 4 years old the world still makes sense, as long as the snacks hold out. That is where it actually started. Not when I activated the termination clause, not when I bought the debt. When I got in the passenger seat and said, "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning." I have thought a lot about what Dolores Whitmore believed she was doing. I don't think she saw herself as a cruel person. People like her rarely do. She believed she was protecting something she had built, managing a situation, making a practical decision. She had looked at my daughter and done a calculation, and the calculation had told her that my daughter was a variable she could remove. What the calculation missed was character, my daughter's and mine. There is a kind of intelligence that shows up on spreadsheets and in org charts, and there is another kind that accumulates quietly over decades, in the details other people don't bother to read, in the patience to build something and then wait to see whether it will ever be needed. Dolores had the first kind. She had built a firm and a reputation and a social position, and she understood how to use all of them. What she did not have was the wisdom to ask what she didn't know. That gap is where her plan failed, not in the courtroom, long before that, And my daughter. I watched her walk into that ninth-floor office 3 weeks after the gala, wearing a blazer she had chosen herself, and I thought about the 4 years she had spent trying to earn something that was never going to be given to her. 4 years of staying later, dressing more carefully, speaking more precisely in every meeting because Dolores had a way of listening that made you feel like you were always being graded. My daughter had brought 63 clients into that firm. She had built a team from scratch. She had done it with integrity, even when the people around her were doing something else entirely. That is not nothing. That is everything, actually. When the clients were given a choice, 59 of them stayed with her. They did not stay with the firm. They stayed with her because she had been honest with them for 4 years, and honesty has a longer memory than people expect. What I want anyone watching this to understand is that none of what happened was luck. It was the result of choices made over a long time by people of different characters arriving at their natural conclusions. Dolores made her choices, Conrad made his, Douglas made his, and my daughter, through 4 years of difficult circumstances, made hers. She did not compromise her client relationships to please her mother-in-law. She did not falsify anything. She did not take shortcuts. She just kept doing the work the right way, even when the environment she was doing it in was rotten. That is its own kind of strength. Quiet, unglamorous, the kind that doesn't show up until the moment it suddenly shows up completely. I am 63 years old, and I have made enough mistakes to know that the ones that cost you the most are almost never the ones that feel like mistakes in the moment. They feel like shortcuts. They feel like practical decisions. They feel like managing a situation. And then one day the audit trail catches up, or the recording surfaces, or the woman you dismissed as irrelevant walks to the podium and says her name. My daughter named her company something that sounds like somewhere you can breathe. I think that is exactly right. You have to be able to breathe inside what you build. If you can't, it isn't really yours, no matter whose name is on the door. Build something that's actually yours. Protect it with everything you know, and pay attention always to what people do when they think the outcome is already decided. That is when they tell you exactly who they are.